First of all, yeah, 2021 poll showed that 56% of young people globally think that humanity is doomed and there's nothing that I can do and there's nothing that can be done. So I really think that that kind of engagement, that it's really just as important to reframe and think through who you are, what is my role here, than what is happening. Those two things, what is happening externally and what is my role, what can I do, I think, yeah, equally important.
Hello, and welcome to another edition of the Climate Emergency Forum. I'm Herb Simmens, author of A Climate Vocabulary of the Future, and I'm very glad to be your host today. Anyone that paying even a modest amount of attention to the climate crisis is confronted daily with stories showing how rapidly this situation is worsening. Weather extremes, impacts, we talk about that every week on this channel. At the same time, climate action continues to lag far behind what justice and science demands. This combination has produced what might be fairly be called a silent epidemic of climate concern, if not outright climate anxiety and fear. How we understand and respond to this emotional and psychological burden as individuals and as communities and as a society is a critical question that too often goes unexplored. Today, I'm delighted to say that we have with us one of the pioneers in this very field, Margaret Klein Salamon. Margaret is the executive director of the Climate Emergency Fund, a clinical psychologist, and author of Facing the Climate Emergency, a groundbreaking book that has helped thousands of people understand their emotional responses to the crisis and to transform that response into meaningful action. Margaret, you've spent the past decade at the intersection of climate psychology and climate activism. And because of this dual perspective, we're actually inviting you to join us not only for this program, but also for our program next week. Today, we'll focus on climate psychology. Next week, we'll turn to climate activism. But I think we all recognize that the two are deeply connected. Margaret, you were one of the co-founders of the Climate Mobilization more than a decade ago, a small, nimble, bold, and unapologetically radical organization that was among the very first, and maybe the first, to insist that we were in a true climate emergency and needed to act accordingly. And you were right, long before most major climate groups were willing to say so. I personally got my start in climate activism through the climate mobilization and with your inspiration. I worked with you, with Ezra Silk and others, along with my colleague in Montgomery County, Maryland, Jim Driscoll, to help our county become the first jurisdiction in the United States to declare a climate emergency, which would have not happened without your leadership, and to have adopted the then strongest greenhouse gas reduction and carbon removal commitments in the country, if not the world. Margaret, you later became the founding director of the Climate Emergency Fund, a unique philanthropic organization that supports a small but vital set of groups committed to disruptive, nonviolent climate action. We'll talk more about that work next week. And Margaret, as you know, I've had the privilege of working with you over the years, from visiting the Extinction Rebellion offices secretly. We weren't even allowed to say the address publicly in London with you, to inviting you to speak at a major online event we organized in Montgomery County with Congressman Jamie Raskin and much more. So it's an honor to have you here today. Joining us, as always, our regular panelists, Dr. Peter Carter, retired physician from British Columbia, founder of the Climate Emergency Institute, and Paul Beckwith, climate system scientist from Ottawa. As always, please stay with us until the very end of the program, when I'll present what we call the Climate Five, the five biggest climate stories of the past few days, each in under 1 minute. And so we encourage you to like this program, subscribe to our channel, share it with your friends and neighbors, leave your comments and suggestions, and visit climateemergencyforum.org, where you can read our articles, and if you're able to, support the continuation of this channel with a donation. With that, Margaret, welcome. And let me begin with a broad question. How is the climate crisis affecting people psychologically, emotionally, spiritually? A very big question, but one that I don't know anyone more qualified to at least begin to have the conversation on than you, Margaret.
Thank you for that question, and thanks for having me on to discuss. I think that the climate emergency I think, should be viewed as a kind of foundational layer of everyone's psychology, even those who are consciously like not interested in climate. That this is happening in our minds in reflection of what's happening in the world, but it's generally speaking in the unconscious or semi-conscious. It's being defended against very actively. Defenses like denial, it's not happening, but that's not as common anymore. We're seeing a lot more willful ignorance, right? Ooh, I don't want to know about that. That's scary. Yeah, I know enough to know I don't want to know more. Or like compartmentalization, that's a science issue that like it's like not my thing. There's all kinds of psychological defenses that our minds use to protect us from information that it determines is too dangerous or shameful. So for some people, it's kind of pushing its way into consciousness, or they've gone through a kind of psychological process and journey and made that it fully conscious. And for those people, it really becomes a very, very central part of life and mental life because it's so critically important. So, my summary statement of how is climate affecting people's psychology is that it is either conscious, in which case it is a absolutely central part of mental life and psychology and emotional life, or it is being repressed and denied and otherwise defended against to keep it in the unconscious for as long as possible.
Well put, and reminds me of the label, I guess you could say, a label that the author Mark Hertzgaard put with people, maybe, is it fair to say, moving from one of those to the other, when they sort of reach that middle point where they're transitioning into recognizing the nature of it. It's like what he called it is the oh shit moment. So that's kind of the Rubicon, if you will, is crossing the Rubicon.
Yes, I do think there's another critical moment in kind of people's development of a psychological response, which is something, it's not as pithy as the oh shit moment, but it's something around that reconceptualizing oneself as someone who might be able to do something about this and trying to think of oneself as a potential agent rather than just a unfortunate victim.
Yeah, that's that other switch. It's the recognition, and then it's the passivity to the activism, which we'll talk more about next week. Well, I'm eager to turn it over to Paul. I know we've had some discussions over the year or so about climate psychology, and I'm sure you're eager to engage with Margaret. So the floor is yours, Paul.
Thanks, Margaret, and thanks, Herb. One of my questions, I guess, is we tend to try to engage the general public to get the general public to understand the risks from climate change and to push for action. But the general public is getting less and less power in the machinations of society and how things operate. The billionaires are influencing more and more people. I think about half of the resources, GDP of the entire world, are controlled by about 200 people. So if we want to really get change on climate, shouldn't we be trying to figure out how to get through to the people that have money and can actually affect the change? Because the public is having less and less effect and power in society. That's just the way our society is proceeding. So shouldn't we be focusing our attentions on the people that can actually affect change, the people that have power in our present society?
So I agree with you that power has become concentrated through extreme wealth into a shockingly small number of people. However, the public or non-billionaires still do have power, not necessarily through just voting and the usual channels, which have been so degraded. Our democracy is so degraded at this point, but even still the public has power through movements and organizing to create change. So I think most activists would say, yeah, the billionaires have way too much power, so we need to take power away from billionaires rather than we need to try to convince them about climate change. Though, I mean, which one is more likely to succeed? I honestly think it's probably taking power away. I think something about being that wealthy has a very detrimental psychological impact that turning someone I mean I could talk about this though it's pretty speculative.
Yeah, I mean, you could argue that many billionaires actually do know how serious climate change is and some of these other issues. And they're paranoid about societal collapse and they're building their bunkers in New Zealand
Yes.
and so on. So, how do we direct them from thinking that maybe they think it's hopeless and they have to build their bunkers where, they think their money's better spent on that rather than on trying to, say, push through carbon reduction, influence politicians and set up ways. Like it really is confusing to me why we don't get billionaires supporting carbon dioxide removal in a big way and supporting solar radiation management ideas in a big way to cool the planet. Surely it's in their interest to preserve a functioning society, which climate change can rip apart, as we know. So it's a bit of a paradox to me. I don't quite understand. I guess I try to assume from square one that people are rational, but I think that's an invalid assumption.
Yeah, I'm not sure I would start there. I think the question of how people think of themselves is so critical that this is what I was talking about, the switch that people need to flip of like I'm not just here to live my personal life. I'm also a part of something bigger and I can have an impact in that. Similarly for a billionaire, right? But I think the more wealth you have, there's a tendency to really dig into this kind of hyper individualistic
Yeah,
mentality.
self-centered, not trusting the other. Okay, well, what about the rabid climate deniers who say live in LA and they lost their whole neighborhood to wildfires going through LA? Or what about the climate deniers along the coastline that gets a massive storm surge and flooding like New Orleans a few years ago? I mean, do these people actually have an epiphany and say, okay, I was wrong about my climate denial and come on board? I mean, a lot of them just entrench even further, dig in their heels and entrench even further and say this is just a fluke event sort of thing, denying all rational logic and science, right? We're seeing a big turning away from science, certainly in the US. Science is becoming defunded by the present government to larger and larger extents. Even storied, famous institutes like NOAA, are taking huge hits on losing, scientists are losing their jobs, nobody quicker than the climate scientists, for example, in the US. So what we've been doing up to now certainly isn't working. We're very vulnerable to political changes that then change everything. And a lot of the damage, you say, okay, Democrats get in again, the stuff can be reversed, but a lot of the stuff it just can't be reversed easily. If you fire people and they're not working in their professions for 3 or 4 years, it's very hard for them to take up and do what they did previously. So a lot of the damage is permanent. So maybe you can talk about the stress that you see people having from lack of action on climate versus what's happening with the lack of jobs and lack of science belief in the US and other places as well. It's almost like the political stuff is becoming, trumping the climate stuff. People still see climate as sort of a long-term problem. They don't realize that abrupt change can happen and it can be a very short-term problem and affect people.
I think for many climate deniers or skeptics, whatever, is that it can be really a sense of shame and helplessness around the climate. We are so small compared to the climate and compared to the fossil fuel industry and all the forces arrayed against us. And given that our government is mounting such a pathetic response to the climate, or I mean, with the Trump
Fine.
administration, I mean, a
Mhm.
like actively destructive response. So given that, I think there's very little, yeah, hope or agency. I think that those are going to be by far the best things to turn people around on climate denial is a functional system that they can believe could actually be a solution, ideally one that everyone can take part of. This was, I mean, core to
Yeah.
climate mobilization's idea of a World War II scale climate mobilization with all hands on deck. That if a government starts to behave in that kind of rational, mature, fully engaged way and invite other people in, then that kind of, I think, underlying, again, helplessness and shame around feeling helpless, which is particularly challenging, I think, for a lot of men who are supposed to feel, big and strong. Climate makes them feel small and weak. That is the best way to turn around that emotional response. And then, I mean, it's like,
Yeah, and the other thing, observation, we might think that climate deniers, they go sort of quiet or don't say as much as they have less and less evidence on their side. And then we get a cold spell like we've just been having. And then they all come out of the woodwork and say, well, where's global warming? Look how cold it is, right? I mean, this is happening. This happens over and over and over again, right? We think that the climate deniers are fewer and quiet, and maybe they're not as vehemently climate deniers. And then we get a cold spell, and they all come out and jump on it and form snowballs in Congress or whatever it might be, right? This is a thing that they don't really disappear. They just kind of go dormant and then resurface whenever there's one little piece of evidence out of 1,000 pieces of evidence that might say, well, yeah, it's cold.
Thanks, Paul. I'm going to turn it over to Peter in a moment, but I want to make sure that we have time for you to address something that's been on my mind a lot, and I'm sure the minds of a whole lot of people, particularly parents, taking the discussion away from this sort of big picture that we have been talking about. And the fact that, as you know, Margaret, and I think many of our viewers know, there are these international surveys that when I read them, they scared the hell out of me. The percentage of young people, not just in the United States and the West, but all over the world, who have some form of climate anxiety and depression and dread for the future of the world. I mean, it would probably be in the tens or hundreds of millions of people even now. How does a parent or a teacher in a school, what are the kinds of, broad guidelines, if any, for how to address that with people? It's hard enough for us as adults to wrestle with this.
thank you. I have never considered myself an expert in talking with children about the climate emergency. I can say a few things, but anyway, I feel like it's outside of my area of expertise. First of all, yeah, 2021 poll showed that 56% of young people globally think that humanity is doomed. And that is, I mean, I like again, like of course this is like weighing very heavily on people and on their minds and informing so much. I mean, and of course, a sense of nihilism. Yeah. What percentage of people think that humanity is doomed and there's nothing that I can do and there's nothing that can be done? So I really think that that kind of engagement, that it's really just as important to reframe and think through who you are, what is my role here, than what is happening. Those two things, what is happening externally and what is my role, what can I do, I think, yeah, equally important. So that is where I would focus with young people. I mean, I'm a big proponent of telling the truth in really in all matters, including the climate. And so I would not recommend offering a sense of false hope, everything will be fine, don't worry, etc. I mean, the situation is frightening, but I think to tell children, the best thing that you can tell your child, if you can say this honestly, is this is really bad. I am doing everything that I can. We together and with our family, we part of what we are doing as a family is trying to protect humanity in the living world and protect our climate. And there's a lot of other people out there who are doing the same.
Well said. And I hope those who are viewers, who are parents or uncles or aunts or grandparents or whatever. Almost all of us know and are involved with children at some point in our lives and right now. Really to read, to talk to people, to think, as carefully as you can about this incredibly sensitive subject. And I think your words are, a good start in that direction. Let me turn it over to Peter for the last part of today's program. Peter, the floor is yours.
Well, so what I want to say to you, Margaret, is thank you. A big, big, big thank you. I remember very well when you started to get involved and you had to make the very difficult choice, and it was an emotional choice to sort of leave your planned career and immerse yourself and leap into the horrors of climate change. So thanks for that. And yeah, as sort of as we mentioned, it's 10 years since the climate mobilization was started by you and a few partners. It was great to look over that yesterday. It's a huge success. I mean, there's been nothing else like the climate mobilization. And it's still being looked after very well. And it still maintains a focus on survival, which is very, very most obviously important, but one thing that many things about climate change, which we seem to avoid. I want to give you two quotes that I came across that I think are really important. And obviously, I sort of pretend to do the science and communicate it to people, but we've already heard that people don't make their life choices on science or what we call rational. They make their life choices on what is emotional and to varying extents, what is moral. I came across this quote from you. My grandmother was a Holocaust survivor, and she impressed upon me the moral duty to confront evil. And the other one is that if humanity's two choices are to transform or collapse, the only rational, moral choice is to immerse yourself in the struggle to protect all life. Now, there's very, very few people that talk climate change in terms of all life. So that's a very big difference in which you've always sort of been way ahead of things. But so can you talk to me about your book and in particular about grief, but the ethics of doing stuff, the emotional aspect of what works? Your great book.
Thank you. Facing the Climate Emergency: How to Transform Yourself with Climate Truth. So it's a self-help book that tries to lead readers through the kinds of processes that we've been talking about on this conversation around facing the truth, the science, what is actually happening, feeling that emotionally, including very centrally going through a process of grieving for all of the species that have already been lost and people who have already been lost, but also very much grieving for the future that you thought you had, the future that you maybe feel like you were promised. Lise Van Susteren, climate psychiatrist, talks about pre-traumatic stress disorder, a kind of trauma that you could get by looking into the future and seeing what's coming with the climate emergency. So, with the power of that, all of those emotions, all of that grief and terror and rage and shame and all of these feelings that will come if you allow them and invite them into your reckoning with reality, then I challenge people to rethink their life story. Who am I, given that this is happening in the world? It is. I wish it wasn't, but it is. Who am I, and what does my life mean, and what does my ancestry mean, and past, what can I learn from past generations, and my skills and education, and maybe my resources, whatever, what do I have that can be part of trying to solve or mitigate this catastrophe. And then the final step that I invite everyone into is about joining a movement and joining the larger climate movement and basically becoming political, because that's the realm, the public realm, the political and legislative realm that I think is where the needed change can happen.
Thank you, Margaret. We're going to have to wrap it up there. for today, but I'm sure those of you who are watching are eager to hear what comes next. And the good news is that Margaret will be back and we'll continue this conversation. And I'm sure we'll find out more of what you're talking about in terms of these sort of very deeply personal decisions that people have to make in the context of this sort of world that's getting more and more out of control. Let me segue to the Climate Five, the five stories that are among the most important this past week. Let me start first with the New York Times having a story about United States auto workers who faced a tough year in 2025 after tax credits for electric vehicles were tossed out. They're now pivoting, interestingly, towards making bigger batteries. They're still in the battery business, and guess what they hope to use them for? For data centers. Ford is currently repurposing car battery production lines to make bigger batteries, and Tesla is expanding efforts in the same space. It says, I don't know if that's an advance in terms of climate to spend it on data centers rather than EVs. I suspect it's not, but it is an important trend that we should keep an eye on. Number two, China saw record high submissions of proposals to build new power plants in 2025, reports Bloomberg News, citing a joint report by the Center for Research on Energy and Clean Air and the Global Energy Monitor. New and reactivated proposals equaling 161 gigawatts, which is a hell of a lot of power, of coal power, were submitted by developers. An analyst that said that China is building coal capacity far faster than it is using it. I guess that's the one good news, that everything that's being built isn't necessarily being used right now. So for those who think that we should look up to China as this wonderful country in terms of dealing with carbon, it's not so wonderful. They're still doing great work in many areas, but not in every area. So, we're going to have a story from down under. By down under, I don't mean Australia, I mean sewers. That a paper just came out recently that estimated the carbon footprint of wastewater management is estimated to be as much as over 3% of the currently estimated global methane emissions by the waste sector. And this came out in a new study. We certainly, at least I don't, and I suspect none of you who are watching, associate sewage with methane and waste and climate change, but it shows how pervasive greenhouse gases are. Hopefully, with this paper, there'll be more attention paid by waste management professionals in reducing climate impacts of waste. With the Winter Olympics starting just 2 days from when this is being recorded on February 6th, Bloomberg had a really interesting story about the future of the Winter Olympics in a heating world there. Talked about a number of challenges, including that many areas of the world will not be able to host the Winter Olympics in the future because of rising temperatures, or they'll have to do so with almost entirely artificial snowmaking, with all the environmental impacts that has and costs. This is going to become, like everything else with climate, a pervasively more challenging situation there. They're even talking about introducing some sports to the Winter Olympics that don't involve snow, such as cross-country races. There's also a challenge about the insurance industry, whether they'll even be able to cover the losses if an Olympics has to be postponed or modified in some respect. So, like every other aspect of our society, the Winter Olympics, and of course the Summer Olympics too, with heat, are being affected. One thing we know for sure, and that is the Olympics 20 years from now, if they're still around, will look very different than they do today. And lastly, is another example of what might be called the shifting baseline syndrome, the fact that things are changing so quickly that what is normal? What do we look back upon? There was a climate scientist who specializes in weather, Daniel Swain, who said it's quite possible that for anybody under the age of 30, in some spots, the cold that we're experiencing in the East Coast of the United States and Canada may well be the coldest week of their lives. But yet people forget how extreme cold feels after just 2 to 8 years of milder winters, according to a 2019 study. And of course, Americans and probably Canadians have gone through a much longer stretch than that. But, even though we're experiencing in the eastern part of North America, extreme cold, first of all, the western part is experiencing extreme warmth. But over the last 30 years, the average daily low in the continental United States has dropped below 10 degrees, which is minus 12 degrees Celsius, 40 times But in the preceding 3 years, again, the past 30 years, 40 times it's dropped below 10 degrees or so, the average daily low. But in the preceding 30 years, this threshold was reached 124 times. So three times as many cold spells from when would 30 years ago be, whenever the math is, from 1955 to 85 or thereabouts, than in the most recent 30 years. And Texas A&M University climate scientist Andrew Dessler has simply said, people have forgotten just how cold it was in the 20th century. That's my Climate 5 for this week. Thank you again for joining us today for a really thought-provoking program. We really, really appreciate you coming today. We so appreciate that you'll be back. And we ask all of our folks who are watching this to return to part 2 of Margaret's conversation with us. Thank you so much for coming today. Goodbye.
Thank you.